Whatever. Ladies and gentlemen, the next astounding installment of the chapter of the episodic serialized story reading bedtime cow from another world uh, show that this is. Uh, Last time, let's see what happened. Coriolanus uh, was dealing with a political upheaval where the poor people in the country wanted uh, a fair share of the wealth of the nation. He was so angry. He said, if you help the poor, they're going to go crazy and run amok. There'll be no end to it. They'll always expect the natural resources to be shared equitably. Better to slaughter them, etc. So he was uh, charged with trying to overthrow the government, and they want to put him on trial and give him the death penalty. And so we begin again with the further adventures of Coriolanus. During the interval before the appointed time, for the Romans hold their sessions every ninth day, which from that cause are called the Mundinoi in Latin, a war fell out with the Antiates likely to be of some continuance, which gave them hope they might one way or the other elude the judgment. The people, they presumed, would become tractable. Their indignation lessened and languished by degrees in so long a space, if occupation and war did not wholly put it out of their mind. But when, contrary to expectation, they made a speedy agreement with the people of Antium, and the army came back to Rome, the patricians were again in great perplexity, and had frequent meetings to consider how things might be arranged without either abandoning Marcius or yet giving occasion to the popular orators to create new disorders. Appius Claudius, whom they counted among the senators most averse to the popular interest, made a solemn declaration and told him beforehand that the Senate would utterly destroy itself and betray the government if they should once suffer the people to assume the authority of pronouncing sentence upon any of the patricians. But the oldest senators and most favorable to the people maintained, on the other side, that the people would not be so harsh and severe upon them as some were pleased to imagine, but rather become more gentle and humane upon the concession of that power, since it was not contempt of the Senate, but the impression of being condemned by it, which made them pretend to such a prerogative. Let that he once allowed them as a mark of respect and kind feeling, and the mere possession of this power of voting would at once dispossess them of their animosity. When therefore Marcius saw that the Senate was in pain and suspense on his account, divided as it were betwixt their kindness for him and their apprehensions from the people, he desired to know of the tribunes what the crimes were they intended to charge him with, and what the heads of the indictment they would oblige him to plead to before the people. And being told by them that he was to be impeached for attempting usurpation, and that they would prove him guilty of designing to establish arbitrary government. Stepping forth upon this, let me go then, he said, to clear myself from that imputation before an assembly of them. I freely offer myself to any sort of trial, nor do I refuse any kind of punishment whatsoever. Only, he continued, let what you know mention, what you now mention, be really made my accusation, and do not you play false with the Senate. On their consenting to these terms, he came to his trial. But when the people met together, the tribunes, contrary to all former practice, extorted first that votes should be taken, not by centuries, but tribes, a change by which the indigent and factious rabble that had no respect for honesty and justice would be sure to carry it against those who were rich and well known and accustomed to serve the state in war. In the next place, whereas they had engaged to prosecute Marcius upon no other head but that of tyranny, which could never be made out against him, they relinquished this plea and urged instead his language in the Senate against an abasement of the price of corn and for the overthrow of the tribunitian power, adding further, as a new impeachment, the distribution was made by him of the spoil and booty he had taken from the Antiates, when he overran their country, which he had divided among those that had followed him, whereas it ought rather have been brought into the public treasury, which last accusation did, they say, more discompose Marcius than all the rest, as he had not anticipated he should ever be questioned on that subject, and therefore was less provided with any satisfactory answer to it on the sudden. And when, by way of excuse, he began to magnify the merits of those who had been partakers with him in the action, those that had stayed at home being more numerous than the other, interrupted him with outcries. In conclusion, when they came to vote, a majority of 3 tribes condemned him, the penalty being perpetual banishment. The sentence of his condemnation being pronounced, the people went away with greater triumph and exultation than they had ever shown for any victory over enemies, while the Senate was in grief and deep dejection, repenting now and vexed to the soul that they had not done and suffered all things rather than give way to the insolence of the people and permit them to assume and abuse so great an authority. There was no need then to look at men's dresses or other marks of distinction to know one from another. Anyone who was glad was, beyond all doubt, a plebeian. Anyone who looked sorrowful, a patrician. Marcius alone himself was neither stunned nor humiliated. In mien, carriage, and countenance he bore the appearance of entire composure, and, while all his friends were full of distress, seemed the only man that was not touched with his misfortune. Not that either reflection taught him or gentleness of temper made it natural for him to submit. He was wholly possessed, on the contrary, with a profound and deep-seated fury, which passes with many for no pain at all. And pain, it is true, transmuted, so to say, by its own fury heat into anger, loses every appearance of depression and feebleness. The angry man makes a show of energy, as the man in high fever does of natural heat, while in fact all this action of the soul is but mere diseased palpitation, distension, and inflammation. That such was his distempered state appeared presently, plainly enough, in his actions. On his return home, after saluting his mother and his wife, who were all in tears and full of loud lamentations, and exhorting them to moderate the sense they had of his calamity, he proceeded at once to the city gates, whither all the nobility came to attend him, and so not so much taking anything with him, or making any request to the company, he departed from them, having only 3 or 4 clients with him. He continued solitary for a few days in a place in the country, distracted with a variety of counsels, with such as rage and indignation suggested to him, and proposing to himself no honorable or useful end, but only how he might best satisfy his revenge on the Romans. He resolved at length to raise up a heavy war against them from their nearest neighbors. He determined first to make trial of the Volscians, whom he knew to be still vigorous and flourishing, both in men and treasure, and he imagined their force and power was not so much abated as their spite and anger increased by the late overthrows they had received from the Romans. There was a man of Antium called Tullus Aufidius, who, for his wealth and bravery, and the splendor of his family, had the respect and privilege of a king among the Volscians, but whom Marcius knew to have a particular hostility to himself, above all other Romans. Frequent menaces and challenges had passed in battle between them, and those exchanges of defiance to which their hot and eager emulation is apt to prompt young soldiers had added private animosity to their national feelings of opposition. Yet for all this, considering Tullus to have a certain generosity of temper, and knowing that no Volscian so much as he desired an occasion to requite upon the Romans the evils they had done, He did what much confirms the saying that hard and unequal is with wrath the strife which makes us buy its pleasure with our life. Putting on such a dress as would make him appear to any whom he might meet most unlike what he really was. Like Ulysses, the town be entered of his mortal foes. His arrival at Antium was about evening, and though several met him at the streets, yet he passed along without being known to any, and went directly to the house of Tullus, and entering undiscovered, and went up to the fire hearth and seated himself there without speaking a word, covering up his head. Those of the family could not but wonder, and yet they were afraid either to raise or question him. For there was a certain air of majesty both in his posture and silence. But they recounted to Tullus, being then at supper, the strangeness of this accident. He immediately rose from table and came in, and asked who he was, and for what business he came thither. And then Marcius, unmuffling himself, and pausing a while, "If," said he, "you cannot call me to mind, Tullus, or do not believe your eyes concerning me, I must of necessity be my own accuser. I am Gaius Marcius, the author of so much mischief to the Volscians, of which were I seeking to deny it, the surname of Coriolanus I now bear would be a sufficient evidence against me. The one recompense I have received for all the hardships and perils I have gone through was the title that proclaims my enmity to your nation. And this is the only thing which is still left me. Of all other advantages I have been stripped and deprived by the envy and outrage of the Roman people and the cowardice and treachery of the magistrates and those of my own order. I am driven out as an exile and become a humble suppliant at your hearth. Not so much for safety and protection should I have come hither, had I been afraid to die, as to seek vengeance against those that expelled me, which methinks I have already obtained by putting myself into your hands. If therefore you have really a mind to attack your enemies, come then, make use of that affliction you see me in to assist the enterprise, and convert my personal infelicity into a common blessing to the Volscians, as indeed I am likely to be more serviceable in fighting for than against you, with the advantage which I now possess of knowing all the secrets of the enemy that I am attacking. But if you decline to make any further attempts, I am neither desirous to live myself, nor will it be well in you to preserve a person who has been your rival and adversary of old, and now, when he offers you a service, appears unprofitable and useless to you." Tullus, on hearing this, was extremely rejoiced, and giving him his right hand, exclaimed, "Rise, Marcius, and be of good courage. It is a great happiness you bring to Antium. In the present use you make yourself, expect everything that is good from the Volscians." He then proceeded to feast and entertain him with every display of kindness, and for several days after they were in close deliberation together on the prospect of a war. While this design was forming, there were great troubles and commotions at Rome, from the animosity of the senators against the people, the, heightened just now by the late condemnation of Marcius. Besides that their soothsayers and priests, even private persons, reported signs and prodigies not to be neglected, one of which stated to have occurred as follows: Titus Latinus, a man of ordinary condition, but of a quiet and virtuous character, free from all superstitious fantasies, and yet more from vanity and exaggeration, had an apparition in his sleep, as if Jupiter came and bade him tell the Senate that it was with a bad and unacceptable dancer that they had headed his procession. Having beheld the vision, he said, he did not much attend to it at the first appearance, but after he had seen and slighted it a second and third time, he had lost a hopeful son, and was himself struck with a palsy. He was brought into the Senate on a litter to tell this, and the story goes that he had no sooner delivered his message there, but he at once felt his strength return, and got upon his legs, and went home alone without the need of any support. The senators, in wonder and surprise, made a diligent search into the matter. That which his dream alluded to was this: some citizen had, for some heinous offense, given up a servant of his to the rest of his fellows, with the charge to whip him first through the market, and then to kill him. And while they were executing this command, and scourging the wretch, who screwed and turned himself into all manner of shapes and unseemly motions through the pain he was in, the solemn procession in honor of Jupiter chanced to follow at their heels. Several of the attendants on which were indeed scandalized at the sight, yet no one of them interfered or acted further in the matter than merely to utter some common reproaches and execrations on a master who inflicted so cruel a punishment. For the Romans treated their slaves with great humanity in these times, when working and laboring themselves and living together among them. They naturally were more gentle and familiar with them. It was one of the severest punishments for a slave who had committed a fault to have to take the piece of wood which supports the pole of a wagon and carry it about through the neighborhood. A slave who had once undergone the shame of this, and had been thus seen by the household and the neighbors, had no longer any trust or credit among them, and had the name of furcifer, furca being the Latin word for prop or support. When, therefore, Latinus had related his dream, and the senators were considering who this disagreeable and ungainly dancer could be, some of the company, having been struck with the strangeness of the punishment, called to mind and mentioned the miserable slave who was lashed through the streets and afterwards put to death. The priests then when consulted, confirmed the conjecture. The master was punished, and orders were given for a new celebration of the procession and the spectacles in honor of the god. Numa, in other respects also a wise arranger of religious offices, would seem to have been especially judicious in this direction, with a view to the attentiveness of the people, that when the magistrates or priests performed any divine worship, a herald should go before and proclaim with a loud voice, "Hoc age, do this you are about," and so warn them to mind whatever sacred action they were engaged in, and not suffer any business or worldly avocation to disturb and interrupt it. Most of the things which men do of this kind, being in manner forced from them and affected by constraint, it is usual with the Romans to recommence their sacrifices and processions and spectacles, not only upon such a cause as this, but for any slighter reason. If but one of the horses which drew the chariots called tense, upon which the images of their gods were placed, happened to fail and falter, or if the driver took hold of the reins with his left hand, they would decree that the whole operation would commence anew, and in latter ages one and the same sacrifice was performed 30 times over because of the occurrence of some defect or mistake or accident in the service. Step on a crack, break your mother's back. Such was the Roman reverence and caution and neurosis in, and caution in religious matters. Marcius and Tullus were now secretly discoursing of their project, with the chief men of Antium advising them to invade the Romans while they were at variance among themselves, and when shame appeared to hinder them from embracing the motion, as they had sworn to a truce and cessation of arms for the space of 2 years, the Romans themselves soon furnished them with a pretense by making proclamation out of some jealousy or slanderous report, in the midst of all the spectacles, that all the Volscians who had come to see them should depart the city before sunset. Some affirm that this was the contrivance of Marcius, who sent a man privately to the consuls, falsely to accuse the Volscians of intending to fall upon the Romans during the games, and to set the city on fire. This public affront roused and inflamed their hostility to the Romans, and Tullus, perceiving it, made his advantage of it, aggravating the fact and working on their indignation till he persuaded them at last to dispatch ambassadors to Rome, requiring the Romans to restore that part of their country and those towns which they had taken from the Volscians in the late war. When the Romans heard the message, they indignantly replied that the Volscians were the first that took up arms. "You guys started it! You started it!" But the Romans would be the last to lay them down. This answer being brought back, Tullus called a general assembly of the Volscians, and the vote passing for a war, He then proposed that they should call in Marcius, laying aside the remembrance of former grudges and assuring themselves that the services they should now receive from him as a friend and associate would abundantly outweigh any harm or damage he had done them when he was their enemy. Marcius was accordingly summoned, and having made his entrance and spoken to the people, won their good opinion of his capacity, his skill, counsel, and boldness, not less by his present words than by his past actions. They joined him in commission with Tullus to have full power as the general of their forces in all that related to the war. And he, fearing lest the time that would be requisite to bring all the Volscians together in full preparation might be so long as to lose him the opportunity of action, left order with the chief persons and magistrates of the city to provide other things, while he himself, prevailing upon the most forward, to assemble and march out with him as volunteers without staying to be enrolled, made a sudden inroad to the Roman confines when nobody expected him, and possessed himself of so much booty that the Volscians found they had more than they could either carry away or use in camp. The abundance of provision which he gained, and the waste and havoc of the country which he made, were, however, of themselves, and in his account, the smallest results of that invasion. The great mischief he intended, and his special object in all, was to increase at Rome the suspicions entertained of the patricians, and to make them upon worse terms with the people. With this view, while spoiling all the fields and destroying the property of other men, he took special care to preserve their farms and lands untouched, and would not allow his soldiers to ravage there or seize upon anything that belonged to them. From hence their invectives and quarrels against one another broke out afresh and rose to a greater height than ever, the senators reproaching those of the commonalty with their late injustice to Marcius, while the plebeians on their side did not hesitate to accuse them of having, out of spite and revenge, solicited him to this enterprise. And thus, when others were involved in the miseries of war by their means, they sat like unconcerned spectators, as being furnished with a guardian and protector abroad of their wealth and fortunes, in the very person of the public enemy. After this incursion and exploit, which was of great advantage to the Volscians, as they learned by it to grow more hardy and to condemn their enemy, Marcius drew them off and returned to safety. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the exciting and astounding further episode of Coriolanus and things on the bedtime story of the cow on from another world, the show that this is. Join us again next time for the next thrilling chapter in the astounding tale of Coriolanus and his adventures in the Roman world. Uh, until that time, ladies and gentlemen, goodbye.